Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Cordant, and in this video I will be making a guide for Pillars of Eternity 1. So this is a guide mostly for new players, but it can also be useful for people who've played the game before. So the reason why I say this is that this guide is going to be focused on playing in the hardest difficulty possible, and also for people who are trying to obtain the Triple Crown achievement. So the Triple Crown achievement, for those of you who might not know it, is, in my opinion, the best challenge and the best achievement to obtain in Pillars of Eternity, which means playing the game in the Path of the Damned difficulty, the highest one, playing also in Expert mode, which disables certain helpful features, and you are also playing in Trial of Iron mode, which means if your party dies at any point in the game is over and your save is deleted. So, kinda harsh, but very satisfying if you get through it. So, the reason why I'm making this guide is that Pillars of Eternity is a complex game. There's a lot of stuff to know. This is kind of common for classic RPGs, which also makes classic RPGs what they are and why they are so amazing and why they are my favorite games of all time. Their complexity brings a lot of enjoyment, but it can also bring a lot of questions and sometimes frustration if you are not used to the game mechanics. So, for example, if you are like me and your background is mostly Dungeons and Dragons games, for example, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, even maybe Neverwinter Nights, if you are familiar with those games and you know that they are playing based on a Dungeons and Dragons rule set, which is the entire rule set that determines how the game is played, the actions you take, and how everything functions, that rule set is the same throughout basically all Dungeons and Dragons games. There are some differences between versions, but overall the gameplay behind it is kind of the same. In Pillars of Eternity, it's not using a Dungeons and Dragons rule set, it's using its own custom rule set. So it has its own gameplay elements, its own rules. It plays in a way similar to Dungeons and Dragons games, but at the same time, very different as well. So also something to note here, I think Pillars of Eternity is an excellent game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. It's an exquisite classic RPG and is also, in my opinion, one of the best spiritual successors to the Baldur's Gate series. And that's saying a lot. So, like I was saying, when I came to play Pillars of Eternity for the first time, I actually did not like the game. I didn't like it at all. I couldn't understand it. I thought the difficulty was poorly balanced. The mechanics were confusing. Everything like that, because my brain was so well accustomed to Dungeons and Dragons that coming here I couldn't understand a lot of this. Now, this is not to say that this guide is only for people who are accustomed to Baldur's Gate or Dungeons and Dragons. It's going to be useful for anybody, even someone that did not play these games before. I'm just giving my own personal experience, I don't know, just for a personal touch. But yeah, when I started playing this, and I know a lot of you are like me, don't pretend you aren't. When I go and play a new game, I usually set the difficulty immediately to the maximum available difficulty. A lot of the times, you can just go through the game without many issues, but then there are other games where you do struggle a lot with, and this is one of them. So, the goal here is I have a lot of different points that I want to bring up that will help you understand how to go about and play Pillars of Eternity, and also maybe help out in making your gameplay experience better, making your party composition better, and even just the way that you approach the game or that you approach enemies more efficient. So, let's get started. Okay, so our first section for this guide is going to be to discuss auto-pausing. So this game plays in real time with pause only, and some of you might be familiar with that kind of gameplay, while other people might not. So real-time with pause, what it means is you move and you take game actions all at the same time. It's always in real time, but you can pause the game at any time to help you, you know, give orders to your characters, be it repositioning, cast a spell, stop what you're doing, stuff like that. And you are going to be pausing the game a lot in Pillars of Eternity. If you want to understand what's going on, you will need to pause the game. Pause to give instructions, pause to cast spells, pause to look at the enemies, look at the combat log, understand what's going on. Pausing the game is tremendously useful. So, one of the first things you can do to help you out with this is go into the menu and go into the auto pause section here, and you can turn on certain conditions. So what this means is when a condition is reached, the game will automatically pause for you. And the ones I would recommend, especially for newer players, would be low endurance and low health, which means when your characters are getting very low on HP, the game will automatically pause for you. On enemy spotted, so this means if you are scouting the area or just running around and you spot an enemy, the game will automatically pause, which will avoid you starting a fight that you didn't actually want to start at that point, which is very useful. And I also like having enemy stopped coupled with stop party movement. So not only does the game pause, but the game will also cancel any movement instructions that your character might have had. So once again, this is to prevent getting into fights that you did not want to get into. A lot of times you are moving throughout the game in fast mode, so you are moving quickly. You might not notice there's an enemy there, and then you start a fight that maybe you didn't want to start like that. Maybe you'd want to buff, maybe you'd want to reposition, anything like that. So that's very useful. Hidden object found, also useful. Sometimes your party will detect a trap or a hidden object, and as soon as it gets detected, the game pauses. Especially for traps, this is life-saving, because same example, you're running around, a trap gets discovered, but you're moving very fast, you might not have time to react, you step on the trap and you die.
And what does the flame reveal?
I haven't been here.
I see.
Ooh! While playing this game, what actually came closest to ending my Triple Crown run was traps. Truly, traps were the biggest challenge in this Triple Crown run. So this to me is life-saving. What else do we have? I also have one for combat start. So whenever combat starts, the game will also automatically pause. It will allow you to look at your enemies, inspect their defenses, decide what you want to do when the combat starts. Because there are also abilities and spells that you can only start casting if the combat has actually started, not before. These are pretty much the only ones I use. You can also have combat auto slow, which means when you start a fight, the game will also will go into slow mode, half speed, which, you know, allows you to see a little bit better what's going on. This one is more, you know, up to your taste. Okay, so the next section is going to be talking about party composition and formations. So, for a party composition, I would suggest, now this is what I personally like using and what I know that is successful in Triple Crown, but you know, there's always wiggle way. But my suggestion for a party composition is I would always want to have a main tank. For a main tank, I would use probably a fighter or a paladin. Personally, I enjoy using story companions, so this would mean Eder or Palagina. They would both work very well for a main tank. I enjoy fighters better, but the paladin is also very useful. Then I would also want to have an off tank, but for an off tank, I would mostly want someone that can also perform a secondary role, especially some kind of utility role. Because in a lot of fights, your main tank is capable of dealing or grabbing the attention of most of the enemies. So you won't even need your off tank for tanking purposes. While other times, some of the enemies might get through, or there's just too many, or you have to cover two fronts, and that's where the off tank really comes in clutch and helps out your party. Because the main goal of your tanks is to be your front line and keep your weaker party members in the back safe. Okay, this is their job. So, in my opinion, I would like something like a Chanter or a Paladin as well. I think those two are probably the best off-tank options, at least from my experience. They can perform the role of an off-tank quite well, not as well as a main tank, but still, while also bringing something else to the table. So a Paladin can heal, it can suspend debuffs, it can revive people, it can do a lot of utilitarian things. It can also bring helpful auras to your party. So it can do a lot more than just off-tanking. And the Chanter, the same thing. So while your Chanter is busy off-tanking, or not off-tanking, just in the party, he's constantly singing, providing your party with buffs. So where can I show this, actually? Yeah, like here. So he's constantly singing, providing your party with buffs. He also has spells in the form of invocations, which are very useful. And this is basically free utility on top of the tank. So that's why I like having a Chanter as an off-tank. And again, personal preference, I do prefer a Chanter over a Paladin, but they are both very strong for that purpose. As the third party member, and these are what I consider the core party members, by the way. So main tank and off tank. The third one will be a priest. Oh, and by the way, so for the off tank, if you enjoy using story companions and not custom-made mercenaries, this would be Kana or Pelagina. Kana the Chanter, Pelagina the Paladin. Durance is the story companion that fits the role of a priest. And a priest is, well, I'm not sure if he's the most important member of the party, but he is very high up there. So priests are mainly the characters that will heal your party when you need it to, although druids can also fit that same role for healing purpose only. They will buff your party excellently well. They are the best buffers in the game, in my opinion. And they can also debuff your enemies quite heavily. They can also fit the role of a ranged attacker. They can be off tanks, kind of, while just providing a lot of utility. The only reason why I don't usually recommend having a priest as the off tank is I want my priests to be able to act and cast spells as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, and I will get into some more details in a bit in this regard, you want to have the lightest armor possible. Or one of the lightest armors possible. Okay? That's the only reason why I say that I don't want a priest as an off-tank. Because the heavy armors, so for example the one that is using heavy armor, this one applies a recovery speed of minus 50%, which would mean we would be casting spells at a much slower rate. And I want my priest to cast as quickly as possible. So yeah, priest, in my opinion, mandatory. You can also have druids. They are very good healers as well, but they are not as good at buffing your party, which in my opinion is more important. And finally, for the fourth core member of the party, I would say get a wizard. In this case, story companion would be Aloth. Wizards are insanely powerful. they have access to a ton of spells, just like the priests. And they can fit multiple roles. You can make a fighter wizard type, or a fighter mage if you're thinking about Baldur's Gate, for example. He can go into the fray, fighting people with swords and axes, whatever you want, fully buffed up while also throwing fireballs and all kinds of elemental magic at the enemies. And it will work out very well. You can make the wizard a full offensive caster. So staying in the back line, shooting people with AoE abilities, fireballs, lightning bolts, all kinds of nasty things. You can make your wizard a control wizard, so just disabling the opponents, debuffing them, making sure they can't do anything. Or you can make a mix of all of those. So I think the wizard really is the most versatile class in the game. I also love magic, so I'm kind of biased in this regard. But wizards do bring a lot to the table. They have a lot of spells per level, and you can customize your grimoire. And again, I will talk a little bit more about the spells at a later point. This is just to show that we have versatility. And like I said, you have a lot of damaging spells, you have disabling spells. You can do a lot of things with a wizard. My preferred approach is making your wizard essentially a debuffer, a disabler, something to control the battlefield. Just make sure your enemies can't do anything, or make them act fast, make them act slower, remove their buffs, anything to make them perform worse in battle, while also having some damaging potential. And in this case, this is actually a good example. My Aloth for this playthrough was mostly a control character, so most of his spells are control spells. Then I have just a couple of spells that synergize quite well with some abilities for his main damaging, for his main damage output, and he was still my highest damaging character. Let me see if I can find it here. Most enemies defeated, Aloth. Most total damage done, Aloth. Most crits, Aloth. So this guy was our biggest killer throughout the entire game. So wizards can be very powerful, and I don't think there's any other class that can reach the same potential that a wizard can. So, like I was saying, these are what I consider to be the 4 core members of any successful party, especially for Triple Crown. It's the way I enjoy playing the game, and that I know that it works. And then I always like to play with the full party, so I always play with 6 characters. But after these 4, you have 2 flex spots, in my opinion. And for these flex spots, I would usually put in damage dealers. So it can either be a pure damage dealer, something like a glass cannon, or a damage dealer that also provides utility. So in this case, I used my main character for one of these flex spots. He is a rogue. He's basically a glass cannon, single target damage dealer. So you can see here that his constitution is very poor. He has only 3 base constitution and only 3 base resolve. So he's very weak defensive-wise. He's very squishy, but he hits very hard. And then I also have a Cypher. So NPC companion would be the Grieving Mother, which also is capable of dealing a lot of damage through spells and through combat itself, while also providing a lot of utility. So this to me is like the perfect party for Pillars of Eternity. Fighter main tank, Chanter off tank, Priest, Wizard, and my 2 flex spots, some kind of damage dealer, and a Cypher. That's my personal preference. It could be a Druid, it could be a Ranger, it could be anything. But I like the utility that Cyphers bring. And again, this didn't need to be a rogue. This could have been a rogue, a monk, a barbarian, a DPS fighter, another wizard. It can be a lot of stuff. But this would be what I would recommend as a party composition. In terms of formations, this is something quite simple, but is also worth mentioning. Right now I'm just using a block formation because it works for what I have. And what I usually do is just, I have my tanks in the front, I have my less squishy back line in the middle, and then the squishier on the back. For this, like I said, block formation works. You can also use a custom formation in which you could do something like this, for example. So let's say that, for example, let's imagine that your priest was a little bit of an off tank, let's say. You could do something like this. And that way...
Of course.
Whoops, I forgot to do this. And this way, if you go into a fight, you are sure that everybody is positioned the way that they should be. So that would be it for the party formation as well as... Sorry, for party composition as well as formation. Let's move on to our next topic. So our next topic is going to be stealth. This one is very simple.
Discreet.
But you have this button right here, scouting, not actually called stealth, but whatever, it's stealth. If you turn this on, your characters will move slower, but they are unseen. So this means that if you are going around an area and there are enemies, you can actually get past them without them spotting you. Although they can spot you, you have like a bar that fills up that shows if you're getting spotted or not. But this means that you can explore an area without people seeing you. And this means that if I were to explore this and there were enemies in this region, I could come over here in stealth and like, okay, let's say there are 5 enemies over there. I could even bring my stealthier character up. So for example, I have my rogue with 7 stealth. I could move him a little bit further up.
As you wish.
Check out what's over there. Decide I want to fight. And then I can position my party in whatever way I find best. And then only send my tank. So that the enemy focuses their attention only on my tank. While my backline is still safe. And this can be done for all kinds of things. We will be talking about party positioning in a bit, and this is going to be crucial for that effect. So move in stealth, check your surroundings, search for enemies, and then when you find the enemies, decide where you want to fight, a place that is more advantageous for your party while also being problematic for the enemy. So my suggestion is, if you are in some kind of area that may contain enemies and you are not familiar with it, always move in stealth. That's just basic knowledge about the game, something that you should get used to. It's gonna make your life a whole lot simpler than just moving around unstealthed. This will get you into trouble, trust me.
I'll see what I can find.
Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about is actually sequencing spells.
What?
This is something I guess I can show with a couple of spells here maybe. Let me see if I can show it with my wizard, for example. So, in this game, if you want to cast a spell, you just go to the spell level that you need, select the spell that you want, and then you decide where you want to cast it. Okay? So you would pick the spell, pick the spot, and then left click, and your character would start casting it. One thing you can do, a lot of people don't actually know this, but it's actually one of the most helpful things in Pillars of Eternity that does not exist in Baldur's Gate, and I wish it did, is that in Pillars of Eternity, you can actually sequence spells. What I mean by this is, let's say that there's a certain sequence of spells that you like casting for specific encounters. For example, let's imagine that I like casting a chill fog, and then on top of the chill fog, I like to cast a slicken and a miasma of dull-mindedness, and then hit them with a fireball. Let's just pretend.
Indeed.
Instead of casting the spell, waiting for it to finish, and then pause the game again to cast the next spell, what you can do is you can pick your spell, pick the spot, click it to cast, then click the second spell you want, select the spot you want, but this time before clicking, you press shift and you click. Same thing for the next spells, so shift, click, and shift, click. Your character is gonna sequence these spells all by himself. So, Slicken, Chill Thought, Miasma of Dull-Mindedness, and Fireball. This is very, very useful. So I'm using my wizard here as an example, but this is particularly useful, for example, for a priest, especially when you have mastered spells. And imagine that these spells are mostly buffs, like my case here. I might want to cast a blessing, followed by a dire blessing, followed by devotions for the faithful. And I might also follow that up with an interdiction on the enemy. So when the fight starts, I can just queue up all these actions and then just focus on doing something else with my other characters. So very small thing, but very useful thing. Okay, so the next topic we have here is positioning. So something similar to what we discussed before regarding formations, and we'll notice that I'm in a different spot. This is just to exemplify this a little bit better. This is a very old save. And in this case, what I have here is I have it there as my main tank, and then I have 3 squishy targets. I have 2 wizards, and I have Kana as a chanter, but he's using an arquebus. So what this means is my formation here is going to be something like this. So Eder in the front and squishies in the back, making something like this. Now over here is unexplored territory. It's Fog of War. So by using what we learned thus far and having my characters in stealth,
Of course.
I can move ahead and while in stealth check out my enemies. So I can even go a little bit further. And we can see that this area is actually quite dangerous. There's a bunch of enemies here, not just this one that was visible from the start. So by using stealth, we already gained a lot of knowledge. Knowing this, now we want to properly position to have this fight. Because one thing that can happen, and I have a quick save ready for this, is if you try to engage and you don't position properly, you're gonna suffer. So I'm gonna show a bad example here. I unstealthed, and I'm just gonna move back for my friends over here. We're gonna start fighting. Well, all stunned already. But what this means is, Eder engaged with the enemies as long as he could, but then they have no reason to just stick around there. They will start ignoring it there and moving for their backline, which is gonna die very quickly. And also something very important, once your backline, or once anybody actually, gets engaged, which is a mechanic where if somebody is like locking you in melee combat, if you try to get away from it, you're gonna get a free disengagement attack. So for example, Kana over here, he's being focused, I'm afraid, I want to run away. If I try to run away, we get a disengagement attack just for more damage. If I want to bring it there to help my friends, he's also engaged, he also takes disengagement attacks, he goes down. And right now, my tank is dead, I have squishy characters trying to run away, and everybody is dying because we just cannot handle this kind of pressure. Let's look at this in a different way, by using proper positioning. And this might seem something very basic, very simple, and it is. It's not any kind of rocket science, but it is very important to get used to dealing with fights in this way. Again, especially if you're playing on Path of the Damned. So, What we have here in order to help us out is the scenario itself. We have this door, this archway here, which we can use as a choke point. So what we can do to help us out is we can put it there over here, which is basically gonna mean that he has a door for a shield. So there is actually gonna be acting as a door for all intents and purposes here. The point of this is the enemies will start coming for my party, but they can only reach there. They will be stuck here, which means they cannot reach my backline. They cannot flank there. We are free to damage them from a safe position, and we're even taking less damage because we're only gonna be getting hit by the enemies that can actually reach there. The ones that stay in the back can't actually do anything. So, just an example, we're not gonna win this fight because this is a very old save. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't even have any spells at this point. And also to note, I don't have one of my core party members, my priest, which would help out tremendously here. But let's just look at the example of how the fight would go by using proper positioning, compared to what we just did. So I unstealthed it, because I want people to focus their attention on it there. We're gonna slow this down.
Hey.
And what we can see here is, they're starting to come in.
Hey.
I'm gonna engage with it there. And in the meantime, my backline can start fighting as well. But this time you see that the enemies cannot reach my backline because they're all stuck. They cannot move past the door. This makes the fight a whole lot simpler. And then another one comes in. And something else that's also very, very useful to know about this is that not only are we keeping our backline safe, as well as it there, because he's not getting flanked, we are also clumping up the enemies in the same position. So why is this good? If you have certain spells or abilities that target an area, it's very easy to hit all of the enemies. Since they're all clumped up, you can just cast a spell and hit everything. So as an example, I have this blind here from Aloth. We can just cast that and see how it works. So, one cast and blinded, we can see on the top left here, blinded, 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 and blinded. So it makes it very easy to hit AoE effects. And even if we want to deal some damage here with our wizards, we have Arcane Assault from both Aloth and my main character. I can just do book. I'm even gonna queue up another book from Aloth, and then book and queue up another one from my wizard and keep shooting this guy. And we can see the AoE damage is actually hitting every single enemy, all because they're clumped up like this. This way we are softening up this enemy group very well before they can even reach us. I'm trying to kill off the weaker ones, by the way. This is also a useful example, by the way. You typically want to pick off the weaker ones before going for the really tanky guy. That's what I'm trying to do with my wizards here. I'm gonna focus them both on this one here. And I can even use my chanter to get some skeletons, why not? But yeah, we're just doing damage. Let's try and keep it alive. It would be actually cool if I could win this fight, but I don't think I will be able to. Okay, he's healed up. Just keep on shooting. Okay, dead.
Backbone to bear this.
Okay.
If we to go down,
Are we actually gonna... I would love to win this, to show off in the video. It would make me very happy. Oh, come on. Skeletons.
Yes. Stand.
Okay, flank the guy. Also, by the way, something also cool to notice about positioning, it's also useful to know about positioning offensively. So, this guy fighting it there one-on-one, he has some advantages. Or, sorry, he doesn't have any disadvantage. But if you can get some of your party members or summons, they also work, to go and hit behind, you can look at this top left over here, it says he's flanked. So by being flanked, he actually is more opened up to enemy attacks,
Following your lead.
making him an easier kill.
Curse
This
your
guy is very
eyes.
tough though.
That's not very helpful.
We actually won! Okay, I'm very surprised and happy about this. But yeah, so just a quick example. This is just an example of a fight naturally, but how this fight can go from absolute
Alright,
chaos where every single one of your party members dies and the game is over, to handling it without any losses and everybody's still fine. So positioning is probably the most important aspect in order to be successful playing in Path of the Damned. Like really, something as simple as using a doorway, rocks, trees in the forest, some kind of cliff, anything like that. Anything that allows you to control the flow of enemies, choke them off and make them clump together, is going to do wonders for defeating your opponents. This is going to be helpful throughout the entire game, by the way. I know that right now we're just some lobby level 3 people, but this is still true at max level against any kind of opponent. So get used to using positioning and choke points to your advantage. Very, very important. Let's talk about engagement. Engagement is a mechanic in Pillars of Eternity that basically locks people in melee combat with each other. So if you know Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, stuff like that, you might be familiar with attacks of opportunity. This engagement works in a similar way. Not exactly the same, but similar. So let's actually look at the description in the game. If we just go to our journal, Cyclopedia, and then Combat Mechanics, there's a lot of good information here, but I'm only going to be focusing on the ones that, you know, actually matter the most in combat. If you look under engagement, it says, engagement occurs anytime a character attacks an enemy with a melee weapon at close range. As soon as the attacker gets close enough, he or she will engage. When a character is first engaged, he or she will stop moving. The character is free to move again, but doing so provokes a disengagement attack. If characters break engagement, they have a limited amount of time before the enemy that is engaged can attempt to re-engage. So, some very important things to note here is that engagement occurs in melee combat only. As soon as the attacker gets close enough, he will be engaged. And very importantly, when a character is first engaged, he or she will stop moving. So, what does this mean? I'm going to exemplify here with some enemies.
Hey.
And I'm going to be using Eder for this.
Alright then.
I'm going to slow this down. So, these enemies are running at Eder. But we can also imagine that these enemies were actually running to somebody in my backline. So, if you want to prevent enemies from reaching your backline or reaching some other character that you don't want them to reach, the best way to do it is to prevent that is to intercept them with some kind of frontline character. So your main tank, your off tank, maybe an animal companion, because by doing so, you will engage the enemy and you will lock them in place. You will see right here. So right now, even if we look at the combat log, we can see the engagements that are occurring. So in this case, we can see that the Acolyte of Berath engaged there in melee. So this guy right here. Eder also engaged the Acolyte of Berath in melee. This one. And also engaged the other Acolyte of Berath in melee. This one here. And at the same time, he also engaged Eder. So in this case, Eder could not reach this guy in melee, this High Priestess. He can only reach these two in melee combat. So essentially, these two guys are protecting the High Priestess right now. The visual representation for engagement are these lines that you can see right here on the floor. So a red line means that this enemy is engaging Eder. So you can see a red line from this guy to Eder, and from this guy to Eder. And the green lines mean that Eder is engaging these two enemies. Now, something to keep in mind, there is an engagement limit to your characters. I believe the default value of engagement is 1, so a single enemy can be engaged. But in this case, I can also demonstrate there are some talents that will allow you to engage more enemies. So in this case, with Eder being a fighter, we have the talent Defender, which is a model ability. If you activate it, you get +2 enemies engaged at the cost of deflection. So this means that Eder could usually engage one enemy, and now he can engage 2 more. So his value right now is 3, which means he can engage these 2 enemies and somebody else that also came along. So the way that engagement works is, when I reach these 2, they both stop moving. They are now locked in combat with Eder. If they wanted to move away from Eder into my backline, for example, or to run away, they would trigger a disengagement attack from Eder. So very similar to an attack of opportunity. The difference between disengagement attacks and attacks of opportunity is that casting a spell while engaged does not trigger a disengagement attack, and shooting a ranged weapon also does not trigger disengagement attack, unlike attacks of opportunity. So the way you can also see this, not only you can check the lines, but if you see, my mouse cursor is now has a red glow, while I have Eder selected. So if I select, for example, Durance, it doesn't have any kind of glow, because he's not engaged. But since Eder is engaged, we see this red glow. This means if I try to move Eder away from melee combat, we're gonna get disengagement attacks. But right now, we are no longer engaged, so we can kind of move for a bit until we get engaged again. And we can see right here, once again, engaged, 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 and engaged. So this is actually the best way you have to try and keep enemies away from your backline. If you see somebody running for your backline, intercept them with a frontliner, typically your main tank, off tank, or maybe, you know, like a melee fighter or an animal companion, something like that. It will lock them in place via engagement and prevent them from coming for your backline. So finally, something else I want to mention. As I just said, the engagement limit on Eder right now is 3. If I turn this off, we can now see that Eder is no longer engaged with both of them. Eder is now only engaged with a single enemy, because he no longer has Defender, so he now only has an engagement limit of 1. So in this case, if this enemy wanted to move away and go for my backline, he is free to do so. He will not trigger a disengagement attack. So what is important also to know about this? You might think, okay, Eder is a tank, or whatever character you might be using, so he shouldn't deal that much damage. True. So if this guy wanted to go for my backline, the attack he would take in terms of disengagement wouldn't actually be that large. So he's not that disencouraged from actually moving away from the tank. But the way that the AI of the game also works is that even if your tank deals little damage, if an enemy is engaged, he's gonna be very unlikely, or it will be very unlikely that you will actually move away from the tank and into your backline. So even if you don't do a lot of damage with your tank, keep in mind you want to have engagements with the tank to lock people in place and prevent them from going for your squishy targets. That's it for engagement. Okay, so our next topic is going to be talking about accuracy and defenses. So when you start engaging in combat in Pillars of Eternity, you need to understand how combat actually works in order to determine how likely you are to hit or miss an opponent and how much damage you are going to be dealing. So for that, the things you need to take into consideration are accuracy score and defenses score. So if you open up your character screen, I'm going to be using it there here as an example, we can see on this left side, we have this section that talks about accuracy, and we have this bottom section that talks about defenses. So if you mouse over any of these things, the game is going to give you a description on how they work, okay, which is very, very useful. And you can also see the values on each of these defenses. So in this case, we can see that Eder has an accuracy score of 105 on his primary weapon, his spear, and an accuracy score of 98 on his secondary weapon, his shield, because this shield in particular grants bash, which just makes it act as an offhand weapon, just shield bashing when you attack. It has its own separate accuracy score. And other than that, we also have our defenses. In the case of defenses, we have deflection, fortitude, reflex, and will. Additionally, you also have damage reduction. The game doesn't consider damage reduction as a defense, but it's also noteworthy to talk about it in this section. Now, if you mouse over these values, the game will also tell you exactly how this number is getting calculated. So in this example, we can see that Eder is getting a bonus of 30 just for being a fighter. The fighter class has this bonus. It gets a +6 from the weapon focus talent, Peasant, a +17 from the weapon itself, because the weapon also has accuracy bonuses. In this case, it's Super, +12, +5 accuracy means +17, and then you also have some other accuracy bonuses, but these only get calculated if certain conditions are true. You get bonuses from your perception score, from your level ups, from several items, from auras, consumables, anything like that is going to be described here. Very helpful. The same thing is true for defenses. Now, the accuracy score is going to indicate how likely you are to hit an opponent. And on the same axis, I guess, the defenses are going to mean or are going to indicate how likely you are to defend against attacks which are coming towards your own characters. So if we make an analogy here with Dungeons & Dragons, Baldur's Gate, Pathfinder, stuff like that, accuracy would be something like your THAC0, your 2-hit chance, or your base attack bonus in Pathfinder, and your deflection are going to be your armor class. So these don't work exactly the same way as in those games, but I'm going to explain exactly how in a second. But for the most part, that's what they mean. How likely you are to hit, how likely you are to defend yourself. Now, to begin, I'm going to be talking about the physical aspect of combat. So I'm talking about hitting somebody with a sword or an axe or a hammer, something like that, or a bow and arrow. I'm not going to be talking about magic just yet. So for the physical aspect of combat, you will always need accuracy. And in terms of defenses, you need the deflection score, the deflection defense, and also damage reduction. So the deflection score is going to mean how likely an enemy is to hit or miss you. And the damage reduction score just means that if you do get hit, the damage you take is going to get reduced by a flat amount equal to your damage reduction against that particular type of damage. I'm going to be talking about damage types in a second, so I'm going to go into detail there. But for now, just have this notion. So you're looking at this and you're seeing values like 105, 132, and you're like, yeah, these are large values. Does it mean they're good? So let's just compare our main tank here, Eder, to our rogue, which is our squishiest target. So Eder has 132, my rogue has 62. So less than half of the deflection score that Eder has, which means I'm much more likely to get hit. But still, these numbers don't mean much unless we understand how the combat actually works. So to see this, I'm going to be using a practical example here
What?
with Eder Endurance. And I'm going to start attacking Eder.
I'll let...
Oh, a miss. Okay. So let's start with a miss. So in order to understand how combat works, we get to use the combat log here. And we see this final line here, Durance misses Eder. And if we mouse over it, we get some calculations being done. Now, one thing to understand before we start focusing on these numbers is that just like in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, in order to attack someone, you have to do an attack roll. This attack roll is performed by using dice. By using dice. So you roll a die, and the result of the die is going to determine if you are going to hit or miss your opponent. So going back to what this says here, we can see that it says ACC 76, which is accuracy, minus def, which is deflection, 137, equals negative 61. And then we can see here roll 29. So in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, you roll a 20-sided die for attack rolls. In the case of Pathfinder, you roll a 100-sided die. But the same concept applies. So in this case, when Durance attacked, a 100-sided die was rolled, and the resulting value was a 29. So to this, we're going to add accuracy and deflection into the equation. So just to refresh our memories, Eder has a deflection score of 137, and Durance has an accuracy score of 76. So looking over this again, we can see that we have an accuracy score of 76, Durance's accuracy, getting subtracted by the deflection score of Eder, 137, which results in a negative 61. So this negative 61 is going to be added to the resulting die roll score. So in this case, we rolled a 29. We're going to be adding the negative 61, which since it's a negative, it's going to subtract. So yeah, we're going to be adding negative 61 to 29, which results in a negative 32, eventually leading into a miss. So if you miss, you deal no damage. Very simple. But unlike Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, where you either miss or you hit, in this case, you can either miss, graze, hit, or critically hit. Now, in Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons, a critical hit means you rolled a 20, so it means you are always going to hit. In the case of Pillars of Eternity, it's different. The way that this works is, if you miss an opponent, you deal no damage, obvious. If you hit an opponent, you are going to be dealing the expected amount of damage. So if you look at the damage that Durance deals, he would deal between 15 and 22. That's the damage you would deal on a hit. If you graze, you are going to be dealing less damage. And if you critically hit, you are going to be dealing more damage. Okay, so very simple. Now, the values to take into account here, and I'm just going to keep attacking to see if I can score a graze or a hit. We can see the graze here. In this case, Durance rolled a 95, so a much higher value. So if you look at the same thing, 76 accuracy gets subtracted by 137 deflection, results in a negative 61. That negative 61 is added to the 95 roll, resulting in a value of 34. So 34 means a graze. So the way the game determines if it's a graze, hit, or a crit or a miss is a miss is any value rolled between, any negative amount up to 15. A graze is anything between 16 and 50. A hit is anything between 51 and 100. And the crit is anything over 100. So naturally, you cannot roll above 100 on a 100-sided die, but if your accuracy is that much higher than the target's deflection, you can actually get a result over 100. That's when you get a crit. Other than that, looking at damage here, we can also see that in this Graze, Durance dealt 11.2 damage, but that 11.2 damage is getting reduced by the damage reduction amount of Eder, which is a 21. So this would also be a negative value. But something to take into account in terms of damage reduction, and we can even see it if we mouse over here. Where does it say? Yeah, so the third paragraph will say, damage will never be reduced below 20% of the initial incoming amount. When this minimum value is hit, you will see a min message in the combat log on the attack line. So if you go over here once again, you can see that 11.2 minus 21 still resulted in a 2.2 damage. And we can see over here the min notification, meaning that we dealt minimum damage. So this is the way that the combat works in terms of attack rolls, and also the way that damage reduction works to determine how much damage you take. Now, that takes care of the physical portion of combat. Now, if we go and talk about magical combat, it's actually not that different. And that's something that's actually quite cool about Pillars of Eternity. Because in Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, you have, when you cast a spell, in order to determine if you hit or not, it depends on the difficulty class of the spell you are casting against the enemy's defenses, stuff like that. In this case, it's once again very simple. You are either going to hit with your spell or you're going to miss with your spell. So this might seem a little bit weird, but yes, in Pillars of Eternity, if you do something like a fireball, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are always going to hit your opponent.
Hey.
Okay? You can also, just like with an attack, you can miss, graze, hit, or crit. So in this example here, Aloth grazed Eder. And just like with attacking with a sword or anything like that, you also make an attack roll for your spells. The difference being, spells target specific defenses. So let's look at an example of this fireball we just tossed. So in this case, we can see here the effect is going to deal freeze damage, but the way you determine if it hits or not is based on your accuracy, plus 10, it's a bonus that this spell has, versus reflex. So this is where the other defenses start coming into play. So Eder had the deflection defense, but now we also have the fortitude, reflex, and will. The same exact concept applies. We tossed a spell, we rolled a 43 in a 100-sided die, we have the same calculation of accuracy minus the defense, in this case it's reflex. You get that result, negative 15, you add negative 15 to the roll of 43, it's a 28, result in a graze. The damage it was going to deal was 29, Eder has a damage reduction of 21, resulting in 8 freeze damage. So exactly the same thing as a normal attack. So it's very simple for you to also understand how these work. What you need to pay attention to in terms of spells is that when you're casting a spell, you need to see what it's actually targeting. So in this case, this chill fog is defended by fortitude, while a slicken is defended by reflex, and something like a mind effect, like arcane dampener, is defended by will. So different defense scores are going to be used against different spells. You can also just mouse over it and you'll see here the little man flexing icon that means fortitude, the little green boot that means reflex, and then you also have the mind symbol, which means will. So same thing for attack rolls as with magic. You can either use deflection, fortitude, reflex, or will to determine if you're going to hit or not. And damage reduction is going to apply both to physical combat as well as to magical combat. Now, something to mention in terms of spells. So not only are we talking about dealing damage with spells, we can also take into consideration something like debuffs. So I cannot actually debuff my ally here, but debuffs have durations. In this case, we have this spell here that will deal this debuff to a target for 14 seconds. This gets modified by the intellect score, but it has a duration. So in this case, if you toss this spell at someone and you miss, nothing happens. If you hit, it's going to do this for 14 seconds. If you graze, it's going to do this, but for a reduced amount of time. I think it's like 50% of the time. And if you crit, it's going to be, I think, 50% more duration. So critical strikes also apply to spells in Pillars of Eternity, both for damage as well as debuffs. The durations will change. Okay, so now focusing once again on the damage reduction portion, we have to talk about damage types. So when you're talking about damage types, it means that different weapons and different spells will be dealing different types of damage. So something very simple to understand, if you have a spell like a Wall of Flame, you deal burn damage. However, if you have something like a Shadow Flame, in this case, it deals freeze damage. These are different types of damage, naturally. And if we look at weapons, the same thing applies. A spear will deal pierce damage, while, for example, an axe is going to deal slash damage. A hammer would deal crushing damage. A rifle would also deal piercing damage. But yeah, you have the different types of damage. And when we're taking into consideration damage reduction, you will see that you have a base amount, this 18 here, and then you have several modifiers. So if you look, for example, at this heavy armor here, it has a base damage reduction of 18, but then it has a crush damage reduction of 23, freeze of 21, and corrode 14. Which means you are stronger versus crush damage and freeze damage, but you are weaker against corrode damage. So this section of damage types and damage reduction is very simple. I think the concept is very easy to understand. So what is also important to note here, talking about defenses and damage reduction? If we go into our journal and we go into the Cyclopedia, then we go into Bestiary, we have entries on the types of enemies that we have fought thus far. So let's look at our trolls here, for example. If we look at this troll, we can see information about its level, its endurance, its accuracy score, damage, damage type, slashing, attributes, and also defenses and damage reduction. So now that we know about accuracy, defenses, and damage reduction, we can use that knowledge in order to better fight our foes. So with the example of the troll, you don't actually want to hit a troll with spells that target fortitude. You can, but you are much more likely to miss or graze, because his fortitude score is 107, it's quite high. However, his reflex score is only 45 and his will score is only 39. So trying to hit the troll with, for example, a killing bolt, which targets fortitude, is likely to miss or graze. However, if we target the troll with something like a Slicken, which targets reflex, or if we use something like an Archimedes Wondrous Torment or an Enervating Terror, which targets will, you are much more likely to hit or even critically hit that opponent. So take into consideration the damaged, the defenses of your enemies when you are fighting them. And if you are playing without expert mode, if you just mouse over an opponent, it's gonna say on the top left of the screen his defenses and damage reduction and stuff like that. If you are not playing, if you are playing with expert mode, which disables those kinds of hints, the way you have to understand what the defenses are on that enemy or the damage reduction on that enemy is just like I showed here. So if you try and hit the enemy with a spell and you mouse over that line on the combat log, it's going to tell you exactly what his defense score is. So if you would target someone with the Nina God Shadow Flame, for example, you can see here the reflex score, the reflex defense of that target. So that's one way you have to learn about their defenses if you are playing in expert mode. And the other way is after you've defeated a certain number of those kinds of enemies, it's also going to show up in the Cyclopedia, in the Bestiary. So this is very important to take into consideration. So like a troll is very strong in terms of fortitude, he's very bulky, but he's not the brightest enemy in the world, so his will score is low, and he's kind of slow, so he's not very nimble, reflex score also low. But if you look at something like, for example, let's see here, a Zorip. A Zorip is much scrawnier, so his fortitude score is a lot lower, but he is more nimble, so his reflex is higher. So you can also kind of make a common sense judgment on what kind of defense an enemy will have. And at the same time, something like a Vitrak, which is like a Mind Flayer in Dungeons & Dragons, he's a spellcaster, so you could expect his will score to be very high, but he's not very tough. So fortitude kind of low, will score very high. So when you're fighting your enemies, take those into consideration to determine what kind of spells you are wanting to use and how to best exploit their weaknesses to win those battles. And just before I forget, so like I was showing in the Cyclopedia about the defenses here for the will score, fortitude, reflex, stuff like that, we also have taken into consideration the damage reduction. So as an example with the troll here, I always like to use a troll as a good example here, because the troll has a damage reduction of 8, but as pretty much everybody knows, if you've played a fantasy game before, trolls are usually weak to fire and acid. So there is no acid in Pillars of Eternity, at least not in Pillars of Eternity 1, I believe, but you do have corrode, which is kind of the same thing. So if we see here, his base damage reduction is 8, so anything you toss at him is going to get reduced by 8, but he is very strong against blunt weapons, so hitting him with something like a hammer isn't going to be very effective because it's going to negate the damage by 16, but he is weak against fire or acid. So if you use something like a wall of flame, a fire breath, a fireball, or something that deals corrode damage, you are going to be dealing more damage than any other type of damage. So damage reduction is also something to take into consideration when looking for your enemy weaknesses. Now, there are times where you might want to hit the enemy with something, but their defense against that something you are trying to do is very high. The way that you work on that is by trying to increase your accuracy as much as possible, because as we saw here, accuracy still takes a role when you are casting spells. So if you want to hit somebody with something and you want to make sure that you hit, or you want to make sure that you have more chances to critically hit, you want to increase your accuracy. And to do that, you can increase your perception score by using, for example, consumables, like the rabbits 2 gives you +2 to perception. You also have spells, like for example, Eldritch Aim, which increases your accuracy by a flat amount. You have something like Durance here that can give you Devotions for the Faithful, just giving you plus 20 to melee accuracy, 20 to ranged accuracy. This is also for physical combat that I'm talking about now. And anything else that may increase your accuracy is something that you want to buff yourself with before you start tossing your spells at the enemies. So also keep that in mind. Okay, and another topic that's quite unique, I think, in terms of Pillars of Eternity is the interrupt and concentration mechanic. So what this means is you can basically read interrupt and concentration as accuracy and deflection. It's kind of the same thing. So when you attack an enemy, your attack has a chance to delay that enemy's current action. So as an example, if I had Aloth cast a spell, especially one that's like a slow speed, let me see if I can have one here. So this one is slow. I'm just gonna cast it somewhere over there.
Aztec worth and wrath.
While this animation was going on and while he was, singing his summoning thingies, if somebody attacks him during that animation, that means it's going to delay that action a certain amount of time. The way this works is, it's not a guaranteed interrupt. So, for example, like in Baldur's Gate, if you get hit by some kind of damage, it has a chance to cancel your spell, you lose the spell. It's not the case in Pillars of Eternity 1. In Pillars of Eternity 1, if you get damaged and interrupted, the action is going to get delayed. This is not only for spellcasting, by the way. It's also for attacks, drinking potions, using abilities. All of those things can get delayed by an interrupt. Now, the way this works is, when you attack and hit someone, you have to roll to see if you are actually going to interrupt or not. And the roll is based on the interrupt and concentration scores. So just like we saw in the accuracy versus defenses section, it's going to be the same thing here. So instead of using accuracy versus deflection, we are using our interrupt score versus the concentration score of the enemy. So it's basically, you would roll, you would use the 39 value here from my rogue's interrupt, then you would subtract the concentration value of the enemy, and then use the dice roll to determine if it's going to interrupt or not. It's basically a very useful mechanic if you are fighting especially spellcasters, because you can just keep on delaying important spells, or if you have some kind of means to interrupt constantly, like for example something like a Wall of Flame. This Wall of Flame you can see here doesn't do a lot of damage, but it's an effect that lingers for 30 seconds and it ticks. I think like every second it ticks damage. And this has an interrupt of 0.5 seconds, which means that if somebody is standing on top of a Wall of Flame, every time they take damage from that Wall of Flame, if Aloth's, or whichever wizard, if Aloth's interrupt score plus the roll goes over the concentration value of the enemy, their current action is going to get delayed by 0.5 seconds. So if you stack these effects, like if you have a Wall of Flame on top of them and you are hitting them with your rogue or whatever else is going on, you can kind of like permanently stun lock an opponent. It's not very common, but it is very, very helpful and it can delay enemy actions by quite a bit. So do use it to your advantage. Now we're going to be talking about areas of effect. So in this game, there are certain spells that you... Oh, and by the way, we're back in the Temple of Aethys because I wanted a save game that's not playing with expert mode. Because one of the things that expert mode does, and this is important if you are trying to go for the Triple Crown achievement, you have to play with expert mode on, is that it will disable areas of effect of spells. Okay? So you are not going to have this helpful indicator here or even this helpful indicator over there. So let's talk a little bit about them. certain spells, like for example a web, a fireball, a blind, something like that, these spells work in an area of effect, or for short, an AoE. So if you look at the description of the spell and you see effect AoE, it means that this will affect a given area, not just a single target. Something that you also want to pay attention to when you're looking at spell descriptions is, and I'm gonna try and open up another one here as a comparison. For example, this one. We can see a difference here in that this one says AoE, while this one says faux AoE. What this means is that this spell here is party friendly. You will never hit your party members with this, while this one that only says AoE can also hit your own party members. So you need to be careful casting spells that only have an AoE effect, not a faux AoE effect. So the ways you have to keep yourself safe and know what's happening is, again, if you look over here, you can see that the area of effect is a 4-meter radius. This is something you're gonna have to base yourself on. Again, if you are playing in expert mode, you're gonna have to judge how much 4 meters actually is. And if you custom, this is actually the area that it will affect. So without expert mode, you can see these circles and you can see this circumference here. So this circumference just means that this inside the circumference is the area in which you can cast a spell without having to move. If you try to cast it away from the circumference, your character will need to move in order to reach a position from which he can cast the spell. It's even highlighted by the footprint icon on the web icon. Other than that, the area that this spell will affect is this entire circle. And the differences between the yellow portion of the circle and the red portion of the circle is that if you have characters hit by the spell in the yellow portion of the circle, they are still safe. However, if you hit them in the red area, they are also going to get hit. This is further demonstrated by if you have the web spell or any spell away from your characters, they are not highlighted. If you move the yellow area on top of them, they are not highlighted. But if you hit them with the red area, they will get highlighted, symbolizing that they will get hit by this spell. So keep that in mind. Something else that can also help you out without having to go to the description every single time. If you are casting a spell that has an area and is not party friendly, it will have a red and a yellow portion of the circle. Whereas if you are casting a spell that is party friendly, that has faux AoE, it will only have a yellow circle. So a yellow circle means you will never hit your own party. If it has a red circle, it means it's gonna hit your own party. So pay attention to those and make sure you are safe from your own effects.
Watch where you're aiming that thing.
Okay, so now we're gonna be talking about attributes. So attributes is something that we could go on and talk about this for a very long time. And I would say if you want to get a little bit of a better understanding on how this works in more detail, you can check out the video where I created, the video that I made for the character creation for this character specifically. I'm gonna link the video, it's gonna show up here, I believe, in YouTube. It's gonna go into detail about this, but generally speaking, I wanna make something very clear, okay? Because this is something that a lot of people struggle with when they're starting the game, especially if you come from other games. And again, I'm gonna make a comparison with Baldur's Gate, Pathfinder, stuff like that. In Dungeons and Dragons, there's a lot of min-maxing and a lot of metagaming that goes into choosing your attributes. It is not the case in Pillars of Eternity, okay? In Pillars of Eternity, you can be very successful with basically any kind of stats, as long as they are somewhat balanced. So, If you want to min-max, you can do so. I did it for my rogue, but be perfectly aware that you do not need it. So for example, since I wanted my rogue to be an agile, long-range shooter for very high damage, glass cannon type of character, I basically neglected Constitution and Resolve. I dumped these stats, which is also very dangerous. And there are certain areas in the game that you can perfectly well see why it's very dangerous. Kill him in one shot.
As you wish.
Well, it wasn't bad. Oh my god. Reveal yourself! Nope, not that button. This button. Okay. Go for him! Go for him! He's a dangerous one. Just leave me alone.
Okay.
Ah! 2 shots down. Okay. Well, that's a good start. Let's get some damage reduction going. While I was also buffing might, dexterity, perception, and also a little bit of intellect. But you don't need it, okay? Sure, I do some more damage and I shoot a little bit faster than if I had less might and less dexterity, and I crit more often than if I had less perception. But the difference is not that great, okay? As an example for this, a lot of people say that the story companions suck because they are not min-maxed. You can create mercenaries and create them in whatever style you like. You can min-max their attributes the way you want. But I'm playing here with the story companions. They have pretty well-rounded stats, like we can see here. So there, he doesn't dump any stat. Kana doesn't dump any stat. Aloth, same thing. Grieving Mother, same thing. Durance, same thing. It's pretty well balanced. My character is a lot more extreme. And all of these characters performed excellently well. I'm talking about Triple Crown, which you can't go any harder than this in the game. And they served me perfectly. Characters can permanently die in Pillars of Eternity. None of them died. They have stayed with me from the beginning. And even if we want to go a little bit further, we can see Aloth here. He has 15 might. He has a base of 12. And perception is 14. Okay, base 11. And if we look at the party records, let's look at this. Most damage done, Aloth. Most enemies defeated, Aloth. Most crits, Aloth. It was not my rogue that's min-maxed for damage. It was Aloth. It's also because the way that Wizards worked. He deals mostly AoE. Sure, there's a reason for it. But I'm playing with 5 story companions, not min-maxed, and this party is perfectly well suited for anything that this game has to throw at us. And by the way, Triple Crown means the base campaign plus all the DLCs, killing all of the major bosses in the game. And we killed every single thing in the game in this playthrough. So do not stress too much about attributes when you're creating your character. Really, there is no need for it. Okay? Just put more points in what makes sense to you. So for example, if you're a damage dealer, put more in might and perception to hit more often. Dexterity to act more often. Intellect if you want more area of effect and duration of spells. If you're a tank, maybe get some more Constitution and Resolve to make you tankier. But overall, you don't need to dump anything to be successful. Our next topic is going to be skills, as we can see right here. Skills, for the most part, are not as important as you might think they are. So it can be very confusing when you are leveling up your characters. You see the skills here and you're like, oh, how many points should I put in athletics, or how many points should I put in survival? What's the best approach for this? What's the metagaming options and stuff like that? And for the most part, guys, just trust me. it's not that relevant. I'm going to try and summarize these in a quick way. So stealth basically means how close to your opponents you can go while under stealth before you get spotted. It's useful for scouting, obviously, but for the most part, man, if you don't have any stealth, you're perfectly fine. Because stealth is mostly used to... At least that's how I do it. Mostly I use stealth to scout around areas and look for enemies, to then position properly and fight them, rather than trying to, oh, there's an enemy over here, I'm gonna try and do like this and... No. So you don't need a lot of stealth. You don't need any stealth even, honestly. The base stealth is more than enough. So Eder has his base stealth from when he was born. It lasted the entire game, it doesn't even matter. On my rogue, I put nothing also, by the way. So my base stealth is 4, and then I just have some passive buffs from somewhere else. Like from my class, from my background, and then a buff I got through a quest. So I didn't even put any points in stealth. You don't need points in stealth, okay? If you want to, be Solid Snake and just solid snacking throughout the fields and getting close to enemies, by all means, but you don't need it. Athletics is useful for... Oh, by the way, something important. The skills are also relevant for certain events, like book events. There will be some book events where you can interact with that event based on some of your skill points. I think athletics is like the one that happens the most. And then maybe survival? I can't even remember. I think it's mostly athletics. But yeah. So athletics is basically... It grants you the ability Second Wind, which is going to heal you for a certain amount of endurance. The more athletics you have, the more it's going to heal. It's not that big of a deal, but if you have points to spend, just place them in athletics because it can be handy as an emergency heal. Lore is important if you want to cast spells from scrolls. So as you can see here, I basically don't have a lot of lore on anyone. I have a few points, but not that much. Because if you want to cast spells from scrolls, you need to have the appropriate lore. You basically have to have double the lore of the scroll that you want to cast. So 8 lore allows you to cast level 4 scrolls. If you had 10, you would be able to cast level 5 scrolls. In PoE 1, I never use a scroll. But if you want to use them, you need lore for it. Mechanics. This is, I would say, the most important skill that you need in the party. But for that purpose, you only need a single character to have it. In my case, I have my rogue. It's fitting thematically. So I have one character with high mechanics. This will allow me to disable traps and pick locks. That's it. Very simple. Survival. This is one that's actually quite handy to have. And I would say that everybody should have at least 6 points in survival. Because what survival does is, when you rest, or when you go for a rest that's not at an inn, so you're resting somewhere in the wilderness, survival is going to allow you to get different bonuses. So you would get bonuses like damage reduction, heal multiplier, movement, racial accuracy bonus, consumable duration, and damage versus flanked. These are the 6 possible buffs. If you only have 1 survival, for example, you can only use this buff here. If you have 2, you can use this one or this one. If you have 3, you can use these 3. If you have 6, you can use all these 6. Okay? If you go over 6, you start getting an additional bonus for the particular buff you are choosing. So Eder over here has 8 in survival, which means he has damage reduction 2 and heal multiplier 2, which means he has a damage reduction of 2 instead of having just 1 point. So I like having in my tanks 8 survival. It means I have all possible options, and I also have access to 2 damage reduction or more heal multiplier. It can be useful. For DPSers, I would say at least get 4 for racial accuracy bonus to be able to hit certain enemies easier. And damage versus flanked, which is always very useful as well. But for the most part, 6 points is enough. If you're a tank, I would recommend 8 to get bonuses on these 2. And if you don't have anything else to do with your points, I would say go up to 10. Because that will allow you to get the second bonus on racial accuracy. It's going to give you plus 15 accuracy versus a specific type of enemy, rather than just having plus 10. It can be handy. But yeah, those are the skills. Don't spend too much time worrying about these. Just place the skills where you think it's relevant. Stealth to move stealthily, athletics, emergency heal, lore to cast spells from scrolls, mechanics on just one character to disarm traps, and survival. I would recommend 6 on all of your companions. If you're a tank, I would go up to 8, and that's basically it. Nothing much to worry about. Okay, so for our next topic, we're going to be talking about itemization and stacking. So, this is something that can be very confusing if you're just starting out the game. You might be used to other games as well, doing something similar. And what I'm talking about is stuff like this over here. Certain items are going to give you certain buffs. For example, this coat here that Eder is using is giving him a buff of +2 to intellect. And usually, a lot of games, what they do is... Okay, so our next topic is going to be itemization and stacking. So, something that you are going to have a lot of in classic RPGs, and Pillars of Eternity is no exception, is going to be items. You're going to have a lot of items. And you're going to have a lot of items which have magical properties. So, something that's very important for you to understand with these magical properties is the way that stacking works in Pillars of Eternity. And how this works is, if you have an item, such as for example this coat here that Eder is using, this item has a magical property that gives Eder a +2 bonus to his intellect score. So this means that if I go and look at my intellect here and mouse over it, it's gonna say that my base intellect is 10, but I have a bonus of 2 from Heldrick's coat. So you might be inclined to, let's say, if Eder, for example, was someone that wanted a lot of intellect, or maybe let's just go for Aloth, for example. So Aloth is a spellcaster. You want to have as much intellect as possible on him. And in this case, I have this belt here, this belt of the Royal Deadfire Cannoneer, that's giving him a +2 to intellect. So you might think, oh, okay, I have my caster. My caster benefits immensely from intellect because it increases area of effect and duration of my spells, which is awesome. I'm gonna give him as much intellect as possible. And you could do that in certain ways. Let me see if I can find one, actually. For example, this one here. This White Crest's Helm. This White Crest's Helm gives me +3 to intellect. So I could take this off. I could go to Aloth and place it on him. Right? This feels good. So I have +3 intellect and... Oops. And then I have +2 intellect, which means I have +5 intellect. But no. If you go over here to your character screen again and look at your intellect score, now you will see that you only have the +3 from the White Crest's Helm. So what this means is, when you have passive bonuses, only the highest bonus is going to be in effect. So in this case, since the bonus from the White Crest's helm is bigger than the one from the belt of the Royal Deadfire Cannoneer, you are only going to get the +3 intellect from this item. You are not gonna get the +2 intellect from this one. So, all in all, you would only get +3 instead of +5. It might be a little bit counterintuitive, but that's the way the game works. This isn't only true for stuff like that. You also have other different kinds of buffs, like for example, plus 10% range damage. This also doesn't stack. So one way that you actually have to check stuff like this is you go to your character, then you go to the character screen, and you start. By the way, if you mouse over this, but this only works for attributes, okay? If you mouse over this, you would see that you don't have the buff from the belt, but it's also very easy to forget that you have certain items that give you intellect or whatever else, so you might not actually notice it. So if you scroll down a little bit, you can check out this active effects section here. What this means is this section will show you all of the effects that you currently have on you. And if you'll notice, and this is the important part, you're gonna see this suppressed message over here on the belt of the Royal Deadfire Cannoneer. So it's saying that the 2 intellect is being suppressed. And if you read and if you mouse over it, it's going to explain to you how stacking works. So stacking rules control how bonuses and penalties are added together. For simplicity, the game distinguishes 4 source categories of bonuses. You have passive, weapons, actives or models, and equipment. And basically, all bonuses and penalties from passive sources and weapons stack. So if you had a weapon that also gave you intellect, it would stack with the belt or with the helm. Active and models use the highest bonus and the lowest penalty to any given statistic. And then you also have the section below where it talks about equipment. Equipment also uses the highest bonus and lowest penalty to any given statistic. It includes all items equipped directly on the character except for weapons. You can read through this in further detail if you want to, have all of the little details, but that's the gist of it. And this really is your best friend in trying to understand what stacks and what doesn't stack, because if something says suppressed, it means you are having something that's not working as intended, or as you would wish it to. So if I remove my helmet again, and I give it back to Durance, if I go back to my character screen, it no longer shows as being suppressed. So yeah, this is basically true for anything that is passive. So even stuff like, don't know if I have an example here at hand, plus 10% range damage, plus 10% damage to flank targets, and I know I have this somewhere. Oh, it's the same thing. Yeah, okay, for example, this chest here. If I put this chest armor, which says plus 10% damage to flank targets, and also these boots, it's not an attribute bonus, but it's still a passive bonus. So they also don't stack. If I come over here and I look at my active effects, we start going further down. And here we can see, yeah, there we go. Vengiata Rugia, which is the chest armor, flank targets suppressed. So look at the active effects section to see if you have anything that's not stacking the way you think it's stacking. It's a very common mistake, and I spent most of my playthrough of PoE 1 thinking that this actually stacked where it didn't. So yeah, keep in mind your items and the way that stacking rules work. The next topic is going to be consumables and food. So this is something that a lot of people neglect, and myself included, but you actually have an entire crafting section over here where you can craft food, you can craft potions that give you all kinds of different buffs and healing. You can craft scrolls, which are also very helpful. So do know that these exist, and the crafting button is right here. And if you want to use them in combat, make sure you have them ready in your quick items slots, because otherwise you won't be able to use them. But the consumable that I use the most is actually food. So food works differently in PoE 1 than it does in PoE 2. So just keep that in mind if you've played the second one and not the first one. In this game, food will give you a bonus for a certain amount of time. In Pillars of Eternity 2, it's gonna last until your next rest. In this one, it's for a set amount of time. So what I would suggest is, when you find foods which are useful, for example this white nefer here, this drink, that just gives you plus 3 damage reduction for 120 seconds, buy it. It's not expensive, it's actually kind of cheap, and they will give you all kinds of different buffs. So endurance, constitution, perception, damage reduction, movement speed, might. You have a lot of different buffs that food can give you. And one of the cool things you can do with food is stack it, because food buffs actually stack. They are active effects. So if I drank this white nefer here, and I can just drop it on top of it there, he does that sound. We can see in his buffs here that he has the white nefer. And I can also give him this Ixamital rice pan, which gives him endurance, constitution, and perception. And he also gets that buff. And I can even give him dragon meat, for example, for resolve and might. Once again, it stacks. So different food bonuses stack. However, if you had a food bonus that gave the same bonuses as dragon meat or the white nefer or anything like that, that will not stack. You will only get the best benefit out of them all. As an example, we have the white nefer giving me plus 3 damage reduction. So if I go over here and I mouse over this, we'll see 3 from white nefer. God damn it, I don't have another one here. Okay, but another common source of damage reduction is actually a beer. And that wouldn't stack. But let me see, do I have something that gives me... Okay, so constitution... Let me see... Okay, so the Ixamital rice pan is giving me 1 constitution.
Hey.
So if I go over here and I look at constitution, it's gonna say 1 more from the Ixamital rice pan. But if I give it there... What was it? A chicken. He will eat it. It will show up under the active effects, but it even shows right here. The Ixamital rice pan, you can see right there, it's grayed out because it is suppressed. The Pearlwood chicken is a superior buff. It's buffing the same things, so max endurance and constitution, so the rice pan is essentially doing nothing. However, I will say that food is very, very handy, especially if you're expecting some kind of tougher fight. Drink a beer for extra damage reduction. Eat some foods for attribute bonuses, movement speed. It's very easy to do. Food is plentiful. You can purchase it in the taverns. They are very cheap. So make sure to use them. They are very, very handy and they will help you out very much. Our next topic is going to be summons. So summons are something that you can get throughout the game via spells, for example, like I have over here in my chanter, an ability to summon 2 ogres. And you can also get it through items. So for example, Eder has this ebony spider figurine. We can check it over here in the quick items. it will summon a Widowmaker and 2 Widowmaker Spiderlings. Yeah, so I need to be in combat to use that. But the idea of summons is, well, not only will they contribute to the fight in several ways, like for example dealing damage or casting spells or whatever they do, but the biggest advantage of using summons in Pillars of Eternity is actually gaining space. So what I mean by this is,
Following your lead.
there are going to be certain fights where you're going to be fighting very, very dangerous opponents. And you might want to do buffing for your party before you actually engage. One of the big differences between Pillars of Eternity and something like, for example, Pathfinder, Baldur's Gate, stuff like that, is that in those games, you can pre-buff. Extensively so, making your party absolutely overpowered before actually engaging in combat. In Pillars of Eternity, as you can see right here, our buffs are grayed out. They just say combat only. It means, essentially, that it is not possible to pre-buff in Pillars of Eternity. So, if you are facing off against a very powerful enemy, you would have to be starting to cast all of your spells while he's coming at you and ripping your party apart, which is problematic. So, what you usually want to do with summons is, like I was saying, is buy space, is buy time. So, if your enemies are over there, what you can do is you pump out a bunch of summons, like over here in front of them. You send the summons in to engage with the enemies, keeping them occupied. And while they are busy with the summons, you can have your priest starting to buff your entire party with all of your powerful buffs, like Crowns for the Faithful, Devotions for the Faithful, extra accuracy, whatever you need. You can buff in relative safety while the enemies are busy with the summons. At the same time, not only do you have to rely, or not only do you have time to buff with your priest or with your wizard, getting like self buffs on himself, you can also use that time to consume potions, to activate certain items that give you buffs, or just shoot them from afar. So yeah, summons, especially in Path of the Damned, will not do much for you in terms of actually killing your opponents, but they are very, very, very useful in terms of cluttering the battlefield and keeping the enemies busy while you kill them from afar, or while you are just buffing before actually engaging with your own characters. In that regard, summons are probably the most useful item or spell that you can use for those really tough fights. And everything seems fine. So he's still buffing up. Okay, let's see how this goes. Okay, he's buffed up. I think this is the fire aura. Okay, let's see. So all of my summons are engaged. You are shooting that guy. Blam. Oh, he casts... Okay. Okay, so this went out. We have some people terrified, which I don't like. So let's remove that with the prayer against fear. Let me check the range. 4.85 meters. That's okay. We're gonna get this over here. And then I think we're gonna buff with Crowns of the Faithful. Our next topic is going to be about buffing and debuffing. So, if you have played classic RPGs for a while now, you probably know and understand the benefits of buffing and debuffing. But I know that a lot of new players, and myself included when I was younger, what I thought was, why the hell would I want to cast something like this that lowers their attributes when I can just, you know, fireball them and deal freeze damage? Like, kill them, right? It's a very easy mistake to... Or it's a very easy concept to not fully understand when you're starting out in these games. You might want to try and just damage your opponents instead of trying to debuff them. But that's usually a mistake, in these games especially. Because it's usually more important to try to debuff, disable, hinder your opponents as much as possible to make them unfit to fight while your party is, fully functional, than just trying to kill them quickly enough with raw damage. Because normally opponents will have enough health pools to withstand some amount of punishment, and you can't just kill them outright for the most part. So if you start disabling them, and in this case I'm talking about things like petrifying your opponents or putting them to sleep, putting them unconscious, something that will, for example, lower their attributes. This also means this will lower their will score. It will lower their deflection. It will lower their accuracy. It will make them worse in the fight. And if you can disable your opponents, it's going to be much, much easier for your party to be safe from damage, while also being a lot easier to actually dealing damage to your opponents. So instead of just starting a fight and starting to toss fireballs to your enemies, consider slowing them down. Consider reducing their damage reduction, their deflection, their concentration, anything like that, before actually trying to damage them. At the same time, you might also think, why would I buff myself up with something like, for example, these minor blights here, which takes time to cast this spell, when I could be casting a fireball? And the same thing. So this buff, for example, lasts for 84 seconds, which means you would be in a better state to fight for 84 seconds, just having a long duration of time where you are a better combatant, rather than just dealing flat 40 damage. And being a better combatant, being better equipped for the fight for a long period of time, is going to be a lot more beneficial than just using that spell cast to throw like a fireball at your enemies. This is something that's much easier to notice while playing the game, okay? But trust me, or if you look at my playthrough, you will see this countless times. If you get a cast of, for example, Gaze of the Adragan, and you petrify 5, 10 enemies for 8 seconds, even more if you critically strike them, this means you have a bunch of time to do whatever you want to them. And for example, petrification will also make them take 100% more damage. I think it's 100%. They are paralyzed. They cannot move. They cannot fight back. So not only are you dealing more damage to them, you can reposition your party, you can kill them, you can run to safety, you can use this time to buff up, or use this time to debuff them further even if you want. Debuffing and disabling your opponents is very important, as is buffing your entire party. It is more important than just trying to overload your opponents with damage. For the most part, trying to overload with damage is going to be a less successful approach than trying to buff and debuff. Okay, so now I want to talk briefly about talents. And I'm only going to discuss talents for tanks in this video, in this guide. Because we could talk about talents for every kind of class and a lot of different builds, but that means I would be discussing different builds for different classes, and the combinations are basically endless. Not going to go over that. I am going to go over the tanks because tanks are very important. As I showed previously in the positioning section, tanks are basically the difference between having your party dead or being successful in the encounters. So I want to make sure that at least this information I pass along. So the most important talents for a tank are, in my opinion, weapon and shield style. This will give you bonus deflection, and your shield deflection also applies to your reflex score, which is very good. like we discussed as well, deflection is your main defense against physical combat, along with damage reduction. So very, very important to get deflection as high as possible on your main tank. We also have Wary Defender. This one is going to give you +5 to all defenses except deflection. It's also going to give you +2 enemies engaged at the cost of some deflection. So, kind of counterintuitive to what I just said. You want deflection as high as possible, that's true. But having more enemies engaged is even more important. This means that Eder can grab or can lock in melee more enemies in combat. This will also make it so that if enemies are trying to get to your backline and Eder gets up to them, he can actually lock in place more enemies. It's not a permanent lock. Enemies can still try to ignore Eder and go for your backline, but they are much less likely to try and do so. And if they do attempt it, they will get a disengagement attack in the process. So, Wary Defender is one of the most important talents because of having more enemies engaged. Very, very important. Superior Deflection, more deflection, very simple. Then I also like having Weapon Focus, especially Peasant. The reason why I like to have Weapon Focus Peasant on my main tank is because, this talent gives +6 accuracy for hatchets and spears specifically. Why do I like this? Because if we look at spears, the spear is a weapon. Let me just look at a basic example here. Sell value low to high. Okay, spear. So a basic spear always has a buff to accuracy. Why is accuracy important for a tank? A tank isn't really doing much damage. That's always true. If you want to build your tank to be as tanky as possible, your damage is going to suffer. But accuracy is still important because your tank is also going to have some helpful abilities. For example, you have knockdown. If you hit, this is the important part, if you hit your enemy, you're going to knock them prone, which is a very good debuff to have. You also have something like charge. If you hit your targets, you are going to do crush damage, and in PoE 2 it even stuns, for example. You also have clear out. You have into the fray, for example. All of these things are important tools that a tank has during combat to keep your party members safe as well as disable the opponents, but you actually need to hit your enemy in order to use this. So extra sources of accuracy are always going to be useful. In this case, the spear has the basic bonus of accuracy. That's why a spear is a good weapon choice for a tank. And then you also have the hatchets. Hopefully I have one. Come on, I don't have one? Really? Hatchet. So hatchets, instead of accuracy, they have a bonus to deflection. So the best weapon you can put on your main tank early on in the game is actually a hatchet, because it's just another source of deflection. It doesn't matter if you are dealing a lot of damage or not with your hatchet in melee. What matters is your tank takes as little damage as possible and stays alive as long as possible. So that's why I like having the weapon focus peasant here. Other than that, when you have spare points, I also like having defenses like this. So giving him extra will, extra defenses against stuff that can disable your tank, like Charm, Terrify, Frighten, Dominate, and Confuse. Because if your tank gets disabled, that means that the enemies can start ignoring him and going for their backline. So you want your you want your tank to not be disabled. The same thing for body control, just extra defenses, unstoppable, same thing. In terms of abilities, these are class specific, so I'm not really gonna get into it too much. At most, I guess I could say something about Vigorous Defense being an excellent spell or excellent ability for a fighter tank. The same thing for Unbroken. If Eder drops dead, he will actually revive with 130 endurance and extra defenses. So if your tank goes down, he comes back up to once again help your party. This can really save you in a lot of fights. But yeah, I'm not gonna go too much into this because this is fighter specific, this is generic. So if you want a tank and you have someone like a Chanter as an off tank or a Paladin or whatever, these are all good choices. And if you look at Kana over here, we can see it's basically the same thing. Okay. The next section for us to talk about is the Bestiary. I have actually already talked about this a little bit before, or I showed it a little bit before. And it can be a very good friend to have, especially if you're playing in Triple Crown, where you have Expert Mode disabled. Because if you're playing with Expert Mode, it means you will not be able to see the defenses and vulnerabilities of your enemies. So if you go over here, this is basically the journal. If you go to the Cyclopedia and you go, well, first of all, the Cyclopedia is also very, very useful because it's going to explain to you afflictions and injuries. It's going to explain several tips, equipment stuff, combat mechanics, tutorials basically. It's very useful. But under Cyclopedia, you have the Bestiary, and this is going to show you the enemies that you have previously killed. And the more enemies of that type you kill, the more information in the Cyclopedia you're going to unlock. So, since I've killed a couple of Elder Lions, now I have everything unlocked, and I know their defenses, I know their attributes, the damage type they deal. So, for example, if I were expecting a very large pack of lions as an enemy to encounter or to face by scouting, I could put my main tank with a specific piece of armor that is very strong against piercing damage. It would make him safer. I also know that these guys have a frightening roar. So I would know to start the fight, maybe, by having Durance cast Prayer Against Fear, making me immune to Frightened. Okay? So being able to understand your enemies in the Cyclopedia can be a very big help in order to defeat certain enemy encounters. So make sure you look at the Bestiary. It's very cool, by the way. It also has lore. Well, lions are not very interesting, but for example, a lich... Oops. A lich is interesting to read about, at least to me. Maybe I'm just a nerd. A Vithrak is interesting to learn about. Just a bunch of fun things, honestly. That's it for the Bestiary. So the next topic is going to be resting. Resting is a mechanic that you are going to have to deal with whether you like it or not. And this is a problem for a lot of people actually, or for some people at least. Resting is basically what's going to replenish your resources as well as replenish your health. Because in Pillars of Eternity 1, you have health and you have endurance. After you finish a fight, your endurance goes back to full, but your health stays at the same point that it was. So eventually your health is going to start whittling down until you die, and you don't want that. So resting is the way that you replenish all of your health. Also very important for spellcasters. You have a certain amount of spells per rest. So if you spend all of your spells, the way you get them back is by resting. This is true for basically anything. Even abilities that are per rest are also going to be important for that. So for resting, at least in the highest difficulty, you need to have camping supplies in order to rest. And it's also the only way you have to access your stash. So right now I'm accessing my stash to see what's inside, but I cannot use it. You must camp or return to town to access that slot. Okay? So if I wanted to take something out from my stash, I would need to rest, and during the rest, I can access my stash and do whatever I want. Okay? So also keep that in mind. Oops, okay.
Do you think a
No!
single man...
Not now.
What?
Sorry.
Hey.
Margaret's fire casts
Well, I guess I
light
can demonstrate it.
in dark places.
So by resting, I now have more spells to cast on my levels, and all of the health bars are now full. And I spent one of my camping supplies. Also, if you are going to rest and you are not in a town, as we saw before with the survival skill, you can choose the bonus that you want. Usually what I do is, on my main tank and off tank, I'm gonna go for damage reduction. On my priest, since he's not really fighting, I can either give him damage reduction or heal multiplier, although I prefer damage reduction. And on everything that deals damage, I like going for racial accuracy bonus. So naturally, you're not gonna magically know what enemies are gonna be in front of you, but you can kind of guess. If you reach a certain area that's very wild, like a forest, maybe set the bonus against beasts. Or wilder, because trolls are also wilder. If you go into a dungeon that's very creepy and you start hearing like the wails of banshees, maybe set it to racial accuracy against spirits. Just use common sense and decide what you want to do. Also, with that said, there's also a lot of very useful buffs to pick up when you rest in a town. So if you go to a tavern and you decide to rest there, you have certain rooms you can choose from, and each room is going to cost a different amount of money, but it's also going to give you a certain buff. Some of these resting buffs are actually very powerful, so do look for those and, get those buffs up before you go adventuring. Another very important section to talk about, and this is like one of the most important ones, I guess I can say, is gonna be something related to this item right here. Okay, your pet. I'm obviously kidding. The pets in PoE 1 don't do anything. In PoE 2, they do give you some buffs, which I think was a nice touch. In PoE 1, they're just a companion. If you want to have more success, consider the piglet. He's very cute. He's Mr. Piggy. He is your best friend. Something also that's very minor, but I think it's useful to talk about, because I spent my entire playthrough without actually using this, is that you can create hotkeys for your spells over here. The way to do it is quite simply mouse over whatever you want and then just attribute a key to them. Okay, very simple, very useful. It will save you a lot of clicking. Recovery time. So recovery time is essentially the time that you need to wait between executing two different actions. So for example, something like attacking, drinking a potion, reading a scroll, using an ability, or casting a spell, all of those things are actions. Once you execute one of those actions, before you can execute another one, you will need to wait your associated recovery time. So this is most commonly associated with pieces of armor here. If you can look at this one, for example, this heavy armor piece. This one has a recovery speed of minus 50%, which means that your recovery time is going to be 50% longer. If we mouse over the recovery here, it's going to say basically what I just explained. And if we look at something that's not heavy armor, something like, for example, light armor, the recovery speed is only 15%. So let's see if we can actually exemplify this here. I'm just going to cast two different spells with Aloth while he's using his light armor. We're going to try and see the time it takes. I'm just queuing these up using spell sequencing.
How may I help? Aztec worth and wrath.
So reasonably quick to cast one after the other. But now if I give him, for example, this heavy armor piece, and we cast the same spells, let's see how long it takes.
Aztec worth and
So
wrath.
yeah, I don't have a timer here, but I think it's noticeable that it takes, well, pretty much 50% longer or 35% longer time between spell casts. So generally speaking, what you want is a mix between good recovery time and defense. So for example, we'll see here that my main tank has heavy armor because I don't really need him to act very quickly. I need him to be safe. The same thing for my off tank here. In this case, he's using medium armor, which also gives him a 40% recovery speed penalty. But if we look at my wizard, he has light armor. If we look at the Grieving Mother, light armor. The same thing for my rogue, and the same thing for my priest. So everyone that I want to act quickly, like cast spells in succession quickly, attack as quickly as possible, the same thing here, buff and debuff as quick as possible, I'm using the lightest armor that I can find. Well, naturally, one that also gives me good damage reduction is desirable, but the most important thing here, honestly, is the recovery speed penalty that it applies. The other thing to note about recovery time is that it is affected by your dexterity. So the higher your dexterity score, the more action speed you are going to get. So this is basically kind of the same thing as recovery time. It's just going to make you act faster. The more dexterity you have, the quicker you act. Okay, my friends, and this will be it for this guide. I do realize it will be a long video. I have not yet edited it, but I do believe it's going to be a long video. I think I covered pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about. I will still say that the most important things to consider for a Triple Crown run or for just playing in Path of the Damned is to have a solid party composition, and I suggest the one that you can see here or like I talked about in the party composition section. Auto-pausing with the correct conditions is going to help you out a lot as well. Use stealth to be able to scout ahead and check on your enemies before engaging so you can position properly. Positioning is probably the most important thing you can do to be successful in Pillars of Eternity, both the first game and the second game. Once you get used to positioning and using choke points to your advantage, you are going to be a lot better prepared for whatever comes in the game. Pay attention to defenses, your enemy defenses more specifically. Target their lower defenses, their vulnerabilities. Check the combat log to see what their defenses are, what they are vulnerable to, what they are not vulnerable to. Like the examples we used, trolls are weak to fire and corrode. Blast them with fire and corrode. They are strong versus bludgeoning weapons, so avoid using a hammer, for example, on them. And if you want to use spells, try using something that targets will, because they are weak against will. So confusion effects, for example, are very effective. And other than that, pay attention to your items. Make sure you are not incorrectly stacking your buffs, because that's kind of a waste. Pay attention to items and spells that can give you summons. They will be very important for the tougher fights, giving you time to buff. Buff and debuff properly, because being buffed and debuffing your opponents is going to be the key between winning or losing certain fights. And that's basically it. Make sure you have Mr. Piggy for the best results and just have fun playing the game. So if there is something that I didn't cover, or if there's any specific question that you might have, be it some section of the game or something about, I don't know, items, talents, anything like that, leave a comment below. I will answer you guys in the best way that I can. Any other question at all, whatever question you might have, maybe even a suggestion, leave a comment. I'll read it. I love learning things from you guys as well, and also understanding how different people approach different problems. It's always cool to learn about those things. And yeah, this will be it. So I will say that if you also have a certain section of the game that you are having trouble with, or that you want to see the way that I dealt with it, with this party, I also have my full playthrough, Triple Crown playthrough in my channel. I can also link it up here. So you can also check, you can always check those videos and see how I handled certain fights. And that'll be it. So if you guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this content, and if you do, consider subscribing. There's videos coming out every single day, be it playthroughs, guides, whatever. I'm aiming to keep this at one video a day. And I hope to see you all in some other video. So until then, my friends, stay safe.